Hi and welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the Tormentor Bombard from the Chaos Dwarf range, the new ones from Age of Sigmar, or you can use them for the old world as well. They work great as a fancy miniatures. So I've got some sub-assemblies, done the base separately just so that we can do some Warpstone effects on that, and I'll go over how I created that separately when we get further down the video. It comes with 3 miniatures, 2 of the dwarfs and 1 little hobgoblin dude, and obviously the Tormentor itself. Well, we've done it as the Bombard, but this works effectively if you were to build the sort of Death Streak or rocket battery as well. So the first thing we're going to be doing is some dry brushing, and with this I'm using a large dry brush from the Artify range, and I'm using Citadel Iron Warriors. You could use Lead Boucher, I just wanted a very dark metallic, sort of almost grimdark, these Chaos Dwarfs for how I'm doing them. And what I'm doing here is I'm just going to be dry brushing pretty much the entire model with the Iron Warriors. It acts as a good sort of base for the bronze that we'll be doing a bit later. Trying to keep the brush motions in a similar direction, making sure you catch all the raised areas. Now I've base coated the model in an AK paint called AK Tenebrous Grey. It's a really nice, very dark grey. It's almost black, but it gives a nice dusty sort of finish and a slightly different sort of feel to the metallics that you're putting on. It gives them a sort of dirtier finish. If you were doing this in the Citadel paints, I'm not sure what colour you would use. It's sort of almost black mixed with some purple, but grab yourself from your local supplier some AK Tenebrous Grey and you won't regret it. It's a great paint to use as a base coat for many colours: silvers, golds, greens, blacks, browns. Yeah, it's a good paint. So yeah, just go around the model now, basically covering all of it with your dry brush, leaving your base coat in the deepest recesses and picking out all the major areas. Okay, now the Citadel Stormhost Silver. This acts as our primary highlight. So using the same brush, I wiped a majority of the Iron Warriors off of it, and now following the contours and shapes of the model, just apply this over the areas you want to be brightest, using the same downward strokes. Try not to do cross hatching. Try and keep those strokes in a similar pattern, focusing on the areas that would sort of catch the light with this nice bright silver. And this acts as your main highlight on the silvers. We do a little bit of edge highlighting later with some Stormhost silver in the brush, but this is your main highlight here. So in a few minutes, way less than 10 minutes, you've got a sort of fully highlighted silver model that we've got as use of great for our basing of our further bronze colours that we're going to be doing. Now we're going to apply a wash over all of the silver areas. For this I'm using the Citadel Druchii Violet shade paint, heavily watered down, so it's probably a 70-30, so one drop of Druchii Violet to many drops of water. It doesn't matter to over water it down, because you can always apply more and more over the top. I noticed on the box art that the silvers weren't just null oiled, they had a purplish feel to them. So to replicate that, that's what I'm using the Druchii Violet. Obviously, if you want to use Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade, do so. Again, I'd recommend watering it down a little bit, just so you can get a gradual effect to your shading. Sometimes they can be quite overpowering, but it's just a simple case here of trying to work with the shapes. Remember that where you remove the brush from the model is where the most paint is left. So as you can see, I'm sort of doing it down, leaving the brush away from the downward areas, so towards the base of the model, just so that's where I want the purple to be more intense, which is actually where a lot of the scripting is on the armour panels. That's where I was focusing. I do probably 3 coats of Druchii Violet, and each coat gets progressively less, focusing on the areas that I want to be more intense. So just work around, grow the intensity as you wish. If it reaches the point you're happy with, just stop and then move on. Once that's applied, I'm just going to be using some contrast Black Templar mixed with just a couple of drops of water, just so it flows better. And I'm just going to be applying this over the tops of the wheels, just darkening them down. You can then apply this over to any areas where you want the metal to be extremely dark, almost black, with just the highlights poking through. So I do this on a little bit of those sort of edge plates to keep it drilled into the deck. Use it on those. So any areas you want to be very, very dark black, apply your Black Templar contrast. Again, it's a little bit better than using Nuln Oil. It's a lot thicker. Black Templar over metals, some really good effects. It gives a nice dark black metal feel. So it's quite a large part of the model done now. We're just going to do focusing onto the bronze, and in previous videos I've used Brass Scorpion as the base coat and then gone over it with the Sycorax bronze, but for this one I wanted a sort of washed out bronze effect. So I'm just using Sycorax bronze straight out of the pot, and now I'm just going to be painting in all of the areas I want to be bronze with this. And actually, as you're applying this, you'll notice that the silver is showing through ever so slightly, and that's not a bad thing here. I wanted a washed out feel, that the bronze is very worn down. If you don't want that, then apply a couple of layers as you normally would, but for me I wanted a slightly worn out feel, so where the paint is sort of not applying fully the opacity, you can still see a little bit of that silver. I'm not too fussed about it, as long as it looks smooth. Then I'm happy, because we can be applying a wash over this as well to darken it down a little bit, to add some contrast and some shadows. So yeah, I paint pretty much the trim, the little spiky bits on the front, the bull's head, and the trim around the side panels as well. Right, so now I'm just going to apply some wash. I'm using the Riekland Fleshshade straight out of the pot. Applying a little bit onto the brush, not too much here, I want to control it. So what I'm doing is I'm applying this over any of the little rivets, straight into the rivet holes. And as you can see there, I'm pushing the paint up into that top edge. That's where I want it to be dark. And I'm pushing the paint now into that lower ridge area. So as I mentioned before, where you leave the brush is where the most paint will be left. So you can push and pull the paint to fill the areas you want to fill. And that's what I'm doing now with the shading of the bronze. Only placing the shade paint where I want it to be, have some contrast with the dark to light, pushing and pulling the paint into those recessed areas, and then dropping little dabs of it over the rivet holes, over the rivet markings, so that it pulls around it, leaving natural contrast between the top of the rivet and the shadowed areas around it. Once all of your wash work is done and nice and dry, but a good 15 minutes it'll probably take to dry, use the Stormhost silver straight out of the pot, and now I'm just going to be doing some simple edge highlighting. So highlighting all the areas that you want it to be bright, the trim areas of the bronze as well as the trim and flat areas of the silver. This is a highlight colour you can use for both the bronze and the metal work. Again, try not to apply too much, only apply it in those areas that you really want it to be bright and fully washed out if it's the bronze. Just adding some highlights there just to show some shape, some definition, and to add some bright points to your silver work. And actually at that point, it's a huge majority of this model is done. we're going to do applying some effects for the gem and the bull's eyes, and of course the Warpstone glows from inside of it and the flames. Okay, we're now going to paint the gem, and we've got three colours. We've got wine red, blood red and some intense white, all from AK. So the gem, the darkest point of the gem is wine red, so we completely paint the gem in the wine red. And then we're going to use blood red over about 90% of it, covering the sort of, just leaving a bit of wine red in the top left hand corner, and then the white will act as our highlight, over which we're going to put some fluorescent paint. So just base coat all of the gem in the wine red. Dry, you can see I'm now applying the blood red, only covering sort of 80% of it, even a bit of the wine red to show the darkest points. And then with the intense white, I just apply a dot and a sort of backwards L shape in that bottom corner there, and just a couple of dots of where I want some real bright points. The white is the base coat for the fluorescence, just to make the fluorescence really shine. First off, I'm just using a little bit of fluorescent red from Green Stuff World. So just cover all of the red and the white with the fluorescent red. And then once that's dry, I use a little bit of the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose. And then I just cover the white areas in the fluorescent rose. And that's your completed gem. If you haven't got the fluorescent red, then you could just go to the rose, and vice versa. If you haven't got any rose, you can just keep it at the red. And maybe you could use a little bit of fluorescent orange just to use in the meantime. Right, we're now moving on to the Warpstone Glow. So first off is base coat all of the flames, the bits with inside the engine, and the little bit on the back as well, the little sort of open stove area. Paint all of that in your white. Now we're moving on to the airbrush and using some Vallejo White Ink through the airbrush. As you can see there, I've also painted the bullseye in the white. Just a couple of little sprays of the the Vallejo White Ink, just to give the haloing effect that we do. So I'm pointing the nozzle in the centre of the sort of the heat areas, and just using the gradients that the airbrush naturally gives you just to create halos around those white areas, just to show that there's some bounce lighting happening from the glow areas, that the sort of glow is emanating out. I also put a little bit on the sort of base plate there, just to show that that metal is reflecting the green glow. You could, if you wanted to at this point, use the techniques for the guy that's holding the torch, which I'm going to cover off a little bit later. So the guy on this model is holding a torch, and I wanted to show you how you could paint these glowing effects and not use an airbrush or the fluorescent green that we're going to use. So at this stage, instead of using the airbrush, you could just paint the flame and any green areas, the glowing green, in the Striking Scorpion contrast paint. So you don't use the airbrush at all. If you want to get that sort of airbrushed effect, you can use the white, but use a dry brush and just gently dry brush around those areas and then cover them with the Striking Scorpion green. So if you didn't want to use the airbrush at all and the fluorescent green, you can skip this sort of step and just look at how we do the torch a little bit later on. It will be signposted and on the timeline to show you. But continuing with the airbrush, we've got some fluorescent green, and just fluorescent green in the airbrush from AK with a little bit of water, and just cover all of the white and a little bit of the surrounding area in the fluorescent green. That's dry, give it 10 or 15 minutes to dry. We're now just going to dry brush in some sort of smoky darkness onto those flames. So using a medium sized dry brush, first off we're going to hit it with some black green from AK. So just working in a sort of downward motion, or just catching the edges so that we darken it down a little bit, sort of the areas that are away from the glow. Just run your dry brush across just so you can darken down the areas that wouldn't have been so bright. And on the flame on the top, just work in a downward motion so the top of the flame is darker or cold and the bottom of the flame remains bright green. And then once we've done that, just hit a little bit of the tips with the Tenebrous Grey on the dry brush, just to darken down the tips, the ends of the smoke as the darkest points. I now just wanted to create some extra brightness, so just using the white, just do a bit of edge highlighting around the bottom part of his eye, and then just pick out on the glow on the back from the engine, there's a couple of what look like warpstones in there. So I just pick those out in white, and then I get some fluorescent yellow from AK on the palette, and just over the edge highlight, just put the fluorescent yellow, and over those little bits of warpstone, just apply the fluorescent yellow, just to give some real bright points, real points of heat from the warpstone itself. And that is your Tormentor complete. We're now going to move over to the basing. So again, if you don't want to base it how I have, you can skip this part. But what I did was I stuck some cork down onto the model, onto the actual base, and then I used from Liquitex some gloss gel from their acrylic mediums, and applied it in a sort of stippling effect to sort of create some pointy lava effect, which is how I do the normal lava bases, but obviously for this it's sort of a warpstone type glow. So what I've done is then I base coated it all in the AK Tenebrous Grey, and now with the white ink, a little bit like how we did earlier with the flame, but we're just going to be using the white ink straight from the airbrush. So I use the airbrush, I point the nozzle so that it's sort of half covering the edge of the sort of rock and the top part of the rock, so it just goes sort of over the edges a little bit, just so that the glow is coming over the edge of the rock. And then I pick out some bright points from the stippling that I've created. So anywhere I've created a sort of moat of stipple, I fill in the little holes with the pure white ink, so they're my bright points, and then the natural gradient will create darker points around your bright points. Don't have too many bright points. You need dark to have bright, and you need bright to have dark. So you can see where on the how I've done it is, and it sort of happens haphazardly. It doesn't really happen by design. You can model it so that you get some sort of flowing lava effects, but when you're just doing it haphazardly, you get a more natural feel to where some of those bright points are going to be. So just pick a few out, but just leave some natural parts in, just with the haloing gradient effect. Once you've done that, you need to give your airbrush a good wash out to get rid of the white, and then we're just going to go over it completely in the AK fluorescent green. And once you've done it, it's going to take a few coats to cover it. You can then leave it for a good 10-15 minutes to dry. At this stage, as I mentioned before, instead of using an airbrush, you could do this via a dry brush. So using pure white, pick out your pure points with a brush and then dry brush around it to create your sort of gradient effect very, very softly. It won't 100% give you the same effect as an airbrush, but you can, with a lot of practice, get the same outcomes with nice soft dry brushing. And then with a brush, paint over it in the striking scorpion green if you don't want to use the fluorescent green. The fluorescent greens do brush on okay, but they tend to not work very well when brushed over large areas. That's why the green striking scorpion contrast is really good. You don't get the natural glow that we're getting here with the striking scorpion, but you get a very similar effect, especially when we team it up with some fluorescent yellow a little bit later on, but that will be when I show you how to do the torch on the Chaos Dwarf model a bit later. So yeah, just carry on covering it all with the rest fluorescent green and leave it 10-15 minutes to dry. Once it's dry, I've created myself a little pot of white ink wash, which is 1 part white ink, 2 parts water, 1 part contrast medium, and I made a big pot of it in a contrast medium pot, but you can just make it individually. I just use this quite a lot. And what this contrast sort of white does is give nice intense white, but also runs into recesses as well, so it just works a little bit like a contrast paint, but it leaves a nice pure white. And I just do this, these are the areas that I want to be the brightest that I'm going to be going over in yellow. It looks a little bit garish when we apply the yellow, but we'll be dry brushing it over just to knock it back a little bit and help blend everything. So I had little lines here where I think the Warpstone Glow is sort of lightening itself out, and being, glow is emanating from it. Don't add too much, just small areas of this. Obviously too much, it will break the effect. Once that's dry, it takes about 5 minutes. Grab some of the AK fluorescent yellow and then just paint over the white that you've just applied and a little bit over the green. So where you're following the lines, just a couple of little millimetre either side of that, just so that the fluorescent green blends in to become the pure yellow. And then, much like we did for the effect on the actual Tormentor itself, we're now going to do a bit of dry brushing with some black green and then some Tenebrous Grey. So this will be just a light dry brushing to pick up any of the ridges, darken down any of those areas. We also just hit the sides a little bit just to darken those down. It helps blend in some of that yellow, tones it down a bit, and also just shows that away from the central points of the glow it gets darker, so a lot colder. And then with the Tenebrous Grey, just give it a very subtle dry brush on the top highest points just to really darken those down. So the thing to remember is the brighter is the hotter, the darker is the colder. So that's the main model and the base done. Now going to move across to just showing you how I did the individual models. I'm going to be covering off the guy that's holding the torch, and then I'll go over how I painted the sort of hobgoblin and the guy with his arms on his waist as well, just from individual parts. So really how I'm painting this guy is almost like how we painted the main Bombard itself. We're just using the same colours but just in a different way. So any of the metals that you want, I followed the box art really, so his hat, bit of trim, any of the metal work, just paint in the Iron Warriors. And then yes, you could use lead Bouch here if you wanted it a little bit brighter, but I think the Iron Warriors, it helps. If you use the same colours across your entire sort of army, it helps blend them all in together. The lead Boucher would be a little bit brighter, but again I was going for a sort of darker feel to these models. Plus we'll be highlighting it with a Stormhost silver. But yeah, just base coat it in your silver colour that you used for your main model. I then apply an edge highlight using Stormhost silver. Again, not too much, just a little bit to pick out your main highlight points. You can see I base coated him again in the Tenebrous Grey, but we haven't had to apply any shade, any Nuln Oil or anything. You get a quite good effect just by using the Tenebrous Grey base coat, the actual main coat of the Iron Warriors, and then edge highlighting it with the silver. So I'm going to be painting the leather next, and for that we're going to be using 3 colours, which is AK Leather Brown, which is our base coat, then AK Saddle Brown is our primary highlight, and then Cadian Fleshtone for a sort of subtle highlight and texturing. So base coat all of your leather with the leather brown. So for this guy, it was his sort of underdress area, his shoes, and he's got little sort of wristband parts. So there's quite a bit that was in the leather on him. So yeah, just use the leather brown to cover all of your leather areas. It's a really good paint actually. It's quite a thick paint. You can get away with just 1 coat. I applied 2, but it generally doesn't need it. 1 coat is very, very good. With the saddle brown, you're probably going to be covering 70-80% of the leather brown. So this is just used to primarily edge highlight everything, and then to fill in any areas, raised areas, leaving the leather brown in the darkest areas. So your saddle brown is sort of used to pop all of the edges, pop any raised areas, and also add some texturing. And by texturing, that can be lines, scrapes, scratches, anything like that. Finally, the Cadian Fleshtone is used as a final edge highlight and to apply any of your scratches and sort of used marks. So when there's lots of folds and areas like that, I always use the Cadian Fleshtone to highlight those and then to add little scratch points and rub points around it. Okay, for his robes, using AK Violet Red, AK Magenta and AK Intense Pink, which would sort of be Corn Red, Screamer Pink and Pink Horror in the Citadel range. So I base coat everything. This is a little bit like the leather, really exactly the same principles, just different colours. So we base coat everything in the Violet Red with a couple of coats. Then I pick out all the raised points and any other areas in the magenta, leaving the Violet Red in the deepest shadows. And then again, your final highlight is with the Intense Pink, picking out your raised areas and adding any lines, any marks for texturing. I now just use a little bit of Sycorax bronze just on, he's got a mask, sort of like a drop down visor, so I just paint that in Sycorax bronze, plus the fancy bits at the end of his metal beard. I just pick those out in the Sycorax bronze as well. Moving on to his flesh, it's quite dark on the box art, but I didn't want to go that dark. So what I'm using Citadel Kislev flesh, which is a layer paint. It is quite thin, so you will need 2 or thin coats of this. But I just pick out all of his flesh, his hands, mainly on this model, it's his hands and arms, and a bit on his shoulders, I think, in a couple of coats of Kislev flesh. Once that's dry, I then make a wash using AK wine red and lots of water. So that's 1 drop of wine red and probably 5 drops of water. So it's a heavy wash. You can use Carroburg Crimson or Vulpus Pink from Citadel, but again you need to heavily water them down. Too much. If you don't water it down enough, you'll just turn the flesh completely pink. You could of course use Riekland Fleshshade or any other flesh wash, but I find that using these different colours, reds, blues and purples, really helps give some life to the model. Even mixing them in with the flesh wash as well can help just bring just different colours, different feelings to the model itself. And like any wash, leave it a good 10-15 minutes to dry. If you've watered it down too much, you can always apply a second coat. Once it's dry, I'm then going to use Flayed 1 Flesh, what a name, to pick out all of the raised muscle areas and the knuckles and fingers. Okay, now we're going to move on to painting his torch. We're not going to use the airbrush, as I mentioned earlier on. We're going to be using some contrast paints. So I've base coated the torch completely in white. I then use the contrast paint Striking Scorpion Green straight out of the pot and completely paint over all of the white in the contrast paint, letting the contrast paint naturally pull where it does in all of the recesses, so you can cover it completely in the contrast paint. Right, give it 10-15 minutes to dry. Then using your sort of little white ink wash, I apply this now, painting over the bottom area of the torch where we want it to be brightest, and in any little recesses where I want those to be bright as well, little bright points on the flame. But primarily I want the bottom of the torch itself to be almost completely pure white using this ink. So again, as you can see, I'm dragging the brush into the bottom areas so that most paint pools in those bottom parts. And again, leave this a good 10 minutes to fully dry. Once it's dry, then grab your fluorescent yellow and paint over all of the white and a little bit of the green in the fluorescent yellow. And so without using the airbrush, you've created a really good looking fluorescent green effect torch. And then using our same dry brushing that we did before, we're going to use a little bit of black green and a little bit of Tenebrous Grey, working downward motions from the top of the flame to the bottom of the flame, so that you get very cold to very hot. So dark is hot, and dark is cold, hot is bright. So the top of the flame where all the smoke is will be dark, and then the bottom will be pure fluorescent yellow. So yeah, you can use that method on the flame in the actual machine itself, and then you may struggle to get the same effect on larger areas. That's when the airbrush comes into its own. But on these smaller areas, this using the Striking Scorpion Green instead of fluorescent green can give you a really good finish. Differences that I did for the other models. For the little hobgoblin, I base coated the flesh in the Kislev flesh as normal. I then applied a Riekland Fleshshade all over the flesh, and then the wine red over the top, and then just applied a little bit of the Kislev flesh just to bring back, and then applied the highlights as normal. So it's Kislev flesh, Riekland Fleshshade, wine red, then Kislev flesh, and then the Flayed one flesh, just for that. And then the guy with his hands on his hips, it's hard to get him into focus here. There's a tutorial on the War Despot, and I use pretty much the same methods as I did for him on this, but as you can see there, that guy's painted in a similar way with just a little bit more of the magenta, a little bit more of the silver, and he's got a gem. So there we go. In probably around about an hour and a half, you've got yourself a really good looking Tormentor Bombard with 3 good looking miniatures on top with some lovely glowing effects. Blends nicely in with the rest of the Chaos Dwarf range that I've already painted, which was the War Despot and the Dominator engine. I will be painting the actual Chaos Dwarf dwarfs a bit later on in a separate tutorial which will be coming out. So yeah, that's it. I really appreciate you watching the video. If you haven't already, please do like and subscribe, especially subscribing. The more you subscribe, the more of these videos I can make moving forward. Please add any comments, any feedback is greatly appreciated. If you've got any models you'd like me to paint for you, just get in touch, because I'm also a commission painter. And if you've got anything you'd like to see a tutorial on, again, get in touch, and I can always create a tutorial for you on anything that you're not sure about. So yeah, as always, happy painting, my fellow painters.